If no one in this world chooses you, then you learn how to disappear without making a sound. The words echoed in Eliza Whitmore's mind as the heavy oak door slammed shut behind her, sealing her fate with a final, merciless thud that seemed to shake the very bones in her chest. The rain had already begun to fall, thin and cold at first, then steady, soaking through her worn coat. Within seconds her suitcase hit the stone steps beside her, the latch snapping open just enough for a glimpse of the few belongings she still owned. Everything she was now reduced to less than 20 pounds of. Memory and necessity behind the door. Voices continued, muffled but sharp. As if even the walls could not contain their rejection, she made her choice. Her mother had said, though Eliza knew she had been given none. The street stretched before her, long and indifferent, gas lamps flickering weakly against the growing storm. Carriages passed without slowing, their wheels cutting through puddles that splashed against her boots, each one a reminder that the world had already moved on without her. She did not cry, not because it did not hurt, but because there was no one left to see it matter. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her suitcase as she took a step forward, then another, each one heavier than the last, as if the ground itself resisted her leaving the only home she had ever known. The wind rose, sharp and unforgiving, slipping through the seams of her coat like a whispered warning, you are alone. And for the first time, she did not argue with it. Across the street, partially obscured by the curtain of rain, a black carriage stood motionless, its presence too still to belong to coincidence. The horses did not shift, the driver did not call out, and behind the darkened window, something watched unseen. Eliza did not notice. She kept walking, her gaze fixed ahead, though she had nowhere to go, her steps guided only by the quiet refusal to fall where she had been cast out. A passing couple glanced at her, their expressions flickering between curiosity and dismissal before they turned away, choosing warmth over compassion. It was always easier that way. The rain grew heavier, tracing cold paths down her face that might have been mistaken for tears if anyone had cared to look long enough. She stopped beneath a narrow awning outside a closed shop, her breath shallow, her body trembling not from weakness but from the sudden realization that there would be no door opening behind her, no voice calling her back. There was nothing left to return to. Only then did she allow herself a single breath of stillness, her eyes closing for just a moment as the world pressed in from every side. And somewhere behind her, across the wet, silent street, the door of the black carriage opened without a sound. The carriage door closed with a soft, deliberate click that somehow carried louder than the storm itself. And for a brief moment, the world seemed to pause, as though even the rain hesitated to fall. Eliza did not turn immediately, though something deep within her chest stirred, a quiet instinct that told her she was no longer alone. The sound of measured footsteps approached behind her, unhurried, controlled, each step precise against the wet stone until it stopped, just a few feet away, close enough that she could feel the presence without needing to see it. You should not be standing here, a low voice said, steady and composed, not unkind, but carrying an authority that left no room for argument. Eliza opened her eyes slowly, her fingers tightening around the handle of her suitcase before she turned to face him. He stood beneath the edge of the awning, untouched by the rain, as if the storm itself respected his distance. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark wool that seemed to absorb the dim light, his gaze fixed on her with a quiet intensity that made her breath catch, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar sensation of being seen. I am not standing here by choice, she replied, her voice calm despite the tremor in her hands. He studied her for a moment longer, his gray eyes moving not over her appearance, but through it, as if searching for something deeper than the surface most others judged so quickly. No, he said at last, almost to himself, you are not. The rain grew heavier, drumming against the awning above them, and still he did not move, did not offer empty comfort or shallow sympathy. Instead, he reached into his coat and removed a pair of gloves, slipping them on with quiet precision before stepping fully into the rain, closing the distance between them without hesitation. Eliza instinctively stepped back, her pride rising like a shield, fragile but stubborn. I do not need charity, she said quickly, lifting her chin. Though the cold seeped deeper into her bones, he stopped, not offended, not surprised, only observing her as one might observe something rare and easily broken. That is fortunate, he replied evenly. Because I do not offer charity. The words settled between them, heavy with meaning. She did not yet understand a flash of lightning illuminated the street, and for a brief second, she saw him clearly, the sharp lines of his face, the controlled stillness in his posture, the quiet weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed without raising his voice. Then what do you offer? She asked. Unable to stop herself, his gaze did not waver. A choice, he said simply. And something in the way he spoke the word made it feel unfamiliar, almost foreign, as if it had not been given to her in a very long time. He gestured slightly toward the carriage waiting behind him, its dark silhouette barely visible through the rain. You have nowhere to go tonight, he continued, not as an insult, but as a fact. And I have a place where the storm does not reach. Eliza's grip tightened again, her thoughts colliding with one another, pride, caution, exhaustion, all demanding to be heard at once. And why would you offer that to me? She asked, her voice quieter now. He did not answer immediately, and in that silence, something shifted, something unspoken passing between them before he finally said, because you did not beg. The words struck deeper than anything else had that night. Not cruel, not gentle, simply true. The rain continued to fall, relentless and cold, as Eliza stood at the edge of a decision she had never expected to face, her past behind her, the unknown waiting just beyond the open carriage door. The rain did not soften, as if the sky itself waited for her answer. Eliza stood, motionless, the cold seeping deeper into her bones, while the man before her remained perfectly still, unaffected by the storm or the weight of the moment. A choice, she repeated quietly, the word unfamiliar on her tongue, something she had not truly held in years. Her gaze shifted past him toward the carriage, its door open, its interior shadowed yet undeniably warm compared to the night that pressed against her from all sides. It would be easy, she thought, dangerously easy to step forward, to accept what was being offered without question, to surrender to the relief of not having to decide anything at all. But something within her resisted, not fear, not entirely, but a fragile piece of herself that refused to be carried away without understanding. And if I refuse? She asked, lifting her eyes back to his. He did not hesitate. Then you walk away, he said, his tone unchanged, as though the outcome held no urgency for him. And nothing about your situation improves. There was no cruelty in his words, no attempt to persuade or pressure, only a simple truth presented without decoration. Eliza felt something tighten in her chest, not from offense, but from the quiet realization that he was the first person that night who had not spoken to her with either dismissal or pity. He had spoken to her as if she were capable of choosing for herself. The wind shifted, sending a sharp gust beneath the awning, and she shivered despite her effort to remain steady. Her fingers loosened slightly on the suitcase handle, then tightened again, as if holding on to the last proof of who she had been. You do not even know me, she said, her voice softer now, not defensive, but searching. No, he replied, and for the first time there was the faintest change in his expression, something thoughtful, almost measured. But I know what it looks like when someone has been given nothing and still refuses to ask for more. The words settled into the space between them, heavier than before, and Eliza felt them in a place she could not easily shield. Lightning flickered again, illuminating the street, the empty windows, the distant figures who had long since turned away, leaving only the two of them standing at the edge of something neither had named. What happens if I step into that carriage? She asked, her voice barely above the rain. His answer came after a brief pause, not because he did not know, but because he chose his words carefully. Then your life will not continue as it has, he said, and neither will mine. That was not what she expected. Not a promise of safety, not a guarantee of comfort, but a shift, something shared, something uncertain, yet somehow it felt more honest than anything else offered to her before. The rain traced cold lines along her face as she took a slow breath, her thoughts no longer scattered, but narrowing, focusing on the single moment that would decide everything. She looked once more at the door behind her, now distant and closed forever, then back at the man who waited without impatience, without demand for a heartbeat. The world seemed to hold still, and then, with a quiet motion that felt far louder than it was, Eliza Whitmore released the weight of her past and took a step forward toward the open carriage. The moment her foot crossed the threshold of the carriage, the storm seemed to fall away behind her, as though she had stepped out of one world and into another. The warmth inside was immediate, not overwhelming, but steady. Wrapping around her chilled skin like something patient and deliberate, Eliza hesitated just inside, her hand still gripping her suitcase. Unsure whether she had truly chosen this or simply surrendered to exhaustion, the man entered after her without haste, closing the door with a quiet finality that echoed louder than the one she had left behind outside. The rain continued, relentless and unseen now, reduced to a distant sound against the carriage walls. "Sit," he said, not as a command, but as a simple instruction that expected to be followed. She lowered herself onto the seat across from him, careful, composed. Though her pulse had not yet settled, the carriage shifted, then began to move, the motion smooth and controlled, as if the world itself made way for its passage. Eliza placed her suitcase beside her, her fingers lingering on it for a moment before letting go, a small release that did not go unnoticed. His gaze remained on her, steady, observant, not intrusive, but impossible to ignore. "You have not asked my name," he said after a moment. The statement was neither accusation nor curiosity, only a quiet observation. Eliza lifted her eyes to meet his, her voice steady despite everything that had changed within the span of minutes. "You did not offer it," she replied. A faint shift touched his expression, not quite a smile, but something close enough to suggest approval. "Sebastian Blackthorne," he said, the name settling into the space between them with a weight that seemed to carry more than identity, something deeper, something known even without explanation. Eliza recognized it, not from personal experience, but from the way people spoke in lowered voices when certain names were mentioned, names that belonged to men who shaped outcomes without ever raising their voices. "And you?" he continued. "Eliza Whitmore," she answered, the words leaving her before she could consider them fully. She had almost expected to hesitate, to feel something break as she spoke the name she had just been stripped of, but instead it came out clear, intact, as though it still belonged to her regardless of what had been taken. He inclined his head slightly, acknowledging it without question. The carriage moved through the streets, the rhythm of the wheels steady beneath them, carrying her farther from everything she had known. With each passing second, silence settled, not uncomfortable, but filled with unspoken awareness. Eliza glanced toward the window, though the darkness outside revealed little beyond blurred shapes and distant lights. "Where are we going?" she asked quietly. "Somewhere you will not be turned away," Sebastian replied, his tone unchanged, as if the answer required no further detail. She studied him for a moment, the calm certainty in his voice, the absence of hesitation, and for the first time since stepping into the carriage, something unfamiliar stirred beneath her guarded composure. Not trust, not yet, but the faint outline of something that might one day resemble it. The carriage slowed slightly as it turned, the movement shifting her balance just enough to remind her that this was real, that she had stepped into something she could not easily step out of again. Sebastian's gaze remained fixed on her, not demanding, not distant, but present in a way she had never experienced before. "You are wondering what I expect in return," he said, as if he had followed the exact path of her thoughts. Eliza did not deny it. "Yes," she answered simply. He considered her for a brief moment before replying, "Nothing you cannot choose to give." The answer unsettled her more than any demand could have, because it offered no boundaries, no clear understanding of what this arrangement truly was. The carriage came to a gradual stop, the motion easing until it rested completely, and outside, through the glass, a vast silhouette rose into view. Tall, dark, and silent against the night, its windows faintly lit like distant stars. Eliza's breath caught, not from fear, but from the sudden awareness that whatever she had stepped into was far greater than she had imagined. And as the door opened once more, Sebastian's voice followed, calm and certain. "Welcome," he said, "to the place where your life begins again." The scale of the estate did not reveal itself all at once, but in quiet, deliberate layers as Eliza stepped down from the carriage, her boots touching polished stone that gleamed faintly under lantern light. The air felt different here, still carrying the chill of the night, yet absent of the harsh bite of the storm, as if even the wind had been instructed to soften within these grounds. She lifted her gaze slowly, taking in the towering facade before her, its dark architecture rising with a quiet authority that did not need to announce itself. Tall windows glowed dimly behind heavy drapery, and somewhere within, a clock chimed the hour, the sound deep and measured, echoing across the courtyard like a reminder that time continued whether one was ready or not. Sebastian stepped beside her, not close enough to intrude, but near enough that his presence felt intentional rather than incidental. "This way," he said, his voice low, carrying easily through the open space. Without effort, the grand doors opened before they reached them, not abruptly, but with a smooth precision that suggested long practice. Timing. A man stood just inside, composed, his posture exact, his expression neutral yet attentive. "Your Grace," he said, inclining his head before his gaze shifted briefly to Eliza, not with curiosity, but with acknowledgement, as though her arrival, though unexpected, required no question. Sebastian removed his gloves as he crossed the threshold, his movements unhurried. "Prepare a room," he said simply, "warm and ready tonight." The man nodded once. "At once, Your Grace." Eliza stepped inside, her senses immediately aware of the difference: the warmth, the faint scent of polished wood, and something softer beneath it, the subtle quiet that replaced the noise of the storm behind her. The door closed, sealing the outside world away completely. And for the first time that night, she was not cold. She remained near the entrance for a moment, her hand still resting lightly against the side of her suitcase, as if unsure whether she was meant to move farther in or remain where she stood. The space around her felt vast, yet not empty, filled with a kind of restrained life that existed without needing to be seen. "You are not expected to stand there," Sebastian said, his tone unchanged as he moved further into the hall. She followed, her steps careful, her eyes taking in details without lingering too long. Tall columns, dark wood panels, the faint flicker of candlelight that seemed to breathe against the walls. Nothing here felt accidental. Everything had purpose. Even the silence. A woman approached from a side corridor, her movements efficient, her expression composed. "Your Grace," she said softly, "the room will be ready shortly." Sebastian inclined his head slightly. "Ensure she has what she needs." The woman turned to Eliza then, her gaze steady, neither welcoming nor cold. "Miss Whitmore," she said, as if the name had already been given to her without introduction. "If you will follow me when the room is prepared." Eliza nodded, though the simple acknowledgement felt heavier than expected, as if accepting this place required more than just stepping inside. Sebastian paused near the base of a wide staircase, his attention returning to her with the same measured focus as before. "You will not be disturbed tonight," he said. "Rest is what you require." She met his gaze, searching for something she could define, but finding only that same quiet certainty that had guided every word he spoke. "And tomorrow?" she asked, unable to stop herself. "Tomorrow," he repeated, as if considering it briefly. "We will decide what comes next." The answer did not reassure her, but it did not unsettle her either. It simply existed, open, undefined, like the path she had stepped onto without knowing where it would lead. The woman returned, indicating silently that the room was ready. Eliza hesitated for only a moment before lifting her suitcase once more, her grip steadier now than it had been before she entered this place. As she followed the woman down the corridor, she felt the weight of the night begin to shift, not gone, not forgotten, but no longer pressing against her in the same way behind her. Sebastian remained where he stood, watching not as someone claiming what he had brought into his world, but as someone who had simply opened a door and allowed her to walk through it. And somewhere deep within the quiet walls of the estate, something unseen had already begun to change. The corridor stretched longer than Eliza expected, lined with dim wall sconces whose steady flames cast soft shadows that seemed to follow her as she walked. The woman guiding her moved with quiet efficiency, her steps precise, her presence neither intrusive nor distant, as if she had long ago mastered the art of existing without disturbing the air around her. Eliza kept pace, her suitcase lighter now, not because its weight had changed, but because something within her had shifted, a fragile sense that she was no longer carrying everything alone. They turned once, then again, each corner revealing more of the estate's quiet grandeur, until at last the woman stopped before a tall wooden door. She opened it without ceremony, stepping aside to allow Eliza to enter. "This will be your room," she said softly. Eliza crossed the threshold slowly, her gaze lifting as the space Unfolded before her, the room was warm, not overly grand, but carefully prepared, a fire burning low in the hearth, its glow steady and reassuring. A bed neatly made with thick blankets, a small table set with a pitcher of water and a folded cloth. Everything was simple, yet deliberate, as though someone had anticipated her arrival. Without knowing who she would be, she set her suitcase down near the foot of the bed, her fingers lingering on the handle before releasing it fully this time. The quiet click of metal against wood marking a subtle end to something she had not yet named. The woman moved to adjust the fire slightly, ensuring the warmth would hold through the night before turning back to her. "If you require anything, there will be someone nearby," she said. "You are not expected to leave this room unless you wish to." Eliza nodded, her voice momentarily caught somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief. "Thank you." She managed. The woman inclined her head once, then stepped out, closing the door behind her with a softness that felt intentional, as though even the sound had been measured. The silence that followed was unlike any she had known that day. It was not empty, not pressing, but still, steady, allowing her thoughts to settle rather than scatter. She stood in the center of the room for a moment, unmoving, as if waiting for something to break the illusion that this was temporary, that at any second the door would open again and everything would be taken back. But nothing happened. The fire continued to burn. The walls remained still, and for the first time since she had stepped into the rain, there was no voice telling her to leave. Eliza moved slowly toward the window, her fingers brushing the edge of the curtain before pulling it back just enough to look out. The storm had not stopped, but it felt distant now, reduced to a muted rhythm against the glass. A world she could see, but no longer stood within. Her reflection stared back at her faintly, pale, tired, yet unchanged in a way that mattered. She had been cast out. That truth remained. But she had not disappeared. She turned from the window and approached the fire, extending her hands toward the warmth, watching as the faint tremor in her fingers began to ease. It was a small thing, almost insignificant, yet it felt like the first moment she had allowed herself to feel anything other than endurance. Her gaze shifted toward the door, toward the place where she knew he remained, somewhere beyond these walls. Sebastian Blackthorne had offered her a choice, and she had taken it without fully understanding why or what it would demand of her in return. Yet, as she stood there, the warmth settling into her skin, the silence holding steady around her, one thought rose above the rest. Quiet, but undeniable. This place had not asked her to prove her worth before letting her stay, and that alone felt more unfamiliar than anything she had known before. Sleep did not come easily, though exhaustion rested heavily in every part of Eliza's body. The bed was softer than anything she had known, the warmth steady, the silence undisturbed, and yet her mind refused to surrender completely to rest. She lay still for a long while, staring into the dim glow of the fire as shadows shifted along the walls, each flicker reminding her that everything had changed in a single night. Her hands rested loosely over the blanket, no longer trembling, but not entirely at ease either, as if her body had accepted the safety before her thoughts could follow. When sleep finally came, it was light, fragile, filled with fragments of voices she could not fully hear and doors that closed just before she reached them. She woke before the light had fully claimed the room, her eyes opening to a quiet stillness that felt different from the night before. The storm had passed, leaving behind a faint gray light that filtered through the curtains. Soft and uncertain, Eliza remained where she was for a moment, listening, expecting perhaps to hear something that would remind her she was still in someone else's world, but there was nothing. No raised voices, no hurried footsteps, no sense of being watched or judged. There was only calm. She sat up slowly, the movement deliberate, as if testing whether the room would shift or disappear at her waking. It did not. The fire had burned low, leaving only a gentle warmth behind, and the space around her remained exactly as it had been when she fell asleep, untouched. Undemanding, she moved to the edge of the bed, her feet touching the floor, grounding herself in something real, something steady. Her suitcase sat where she had left it, closed, quiet, waiting without expectation. For a brief moment, she simply looked at it, aware that everything inside belonged to a life that no longer existed in the same way. She did not open it. Instead, she stood and crossed the room, drawn again to the window. The sky outside was pale, the storm replaced by a stillness that stretched across the grounds. The estate revealed now in clearer detail the gardens lay beyond, expansive and carefully tended, their structure visible even beneath the lingering traces of rain. It was not a place of chaos or neglect. It was controlled, ordered, deliberate, much like the man who owned it. A soft knock sounded at the door, breaking the silence without shattering it. Eliza turned, her posture instinctively straightening. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. The door opened just enough for the same woman from the night before to enter, carrying a small tray with tea and bread arranged with quiet care. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore," she said, her tone even. "His Grace has instructed that you take your time this morning. There is no urgency placed upon you." Eliza inclined her head slightly, accepting the tray as it was set upon the table. "Thank you." The woman paused briefly, as if considering whether to say more, then added, "When you are ready, you will be received downstairs." The words lingered after she left, simple, yet weighted with something more than instruction. Eliza stood still for a moment, her gaze shifting from the tray to the door, then back again. There was no demand, no expectation pressed upon her, only an invitation. She moved slowly, taking a seat and lifting the cup, the warmth of it grounding her further as she took a small sip. The taste was simple, clean, unfamiliar in its quiet comfort. She set it down after a moment, her thoughts no longer scattered but gathering into something clearer, something steadier. He had said they would decide what came next, and for the first time since the night before, Eliza Whitmore found herself wondering not what she had lost, but what she might become. Eliza did not rush, though every instinct she had ever learned urged her to do so, to move quickly, to make herself useful, to avoid becoming an inconvenience. But nothing in this place demanded that of her. The tea cooled slowly beside her, untouched now, as she stood once more before the window, her reflection clearer in the morning light. She studied it not with vanity, but with quiet recognition. The same face remained, the same eyes, yet something behind them had shifted, subtle but undeniable. She was no longer standing outside a closed door. She turned at last, crossing the room with measured steps, her movements deliberate as she smoothed the fabric of her dress, not out of obligation, but from a quiet decision to meet whatever awaited her with composure. The corridor beyond her door was as still as before, the soft glow of daylight replacing the flicker of candlelight, revealing details she had not seen the night before: the fine grain of the wood panels, the careful placement of each object, the absence of anything unnecessary. It was a place where nothing existed without reason. The woman who had attended her the night before waited at a distance, as if she had known exactly when Eliza would be ready. "This way," she said gently. Eliza followed, her steps steady, her gaze no longer searching for escape, but taking in what surrounded her with a quiet awareness. They descended a wide staircase, the sound of their movement softened by thick carpeting, until they reached a set of tall doors that stood partially open. Beyond them, a room stretched wide, filled with light from tall windows that overlooked the gardens. A long table stood at the center, set simply, without excess, and at its far end, he stood Sebastian Blackthorne. His presence did not dominate the room in the way one might expect from a man of power. Instead, it anchored it, as if everything around him aligned naturally without effort. He turned as she entered, his gaze finding hers immediately, steady, unchanged from the night before. "You rested," he said, not as a question. Eliza inclined her head slightly. "Yes." The woman stepped back, leaving them without announcement, the door closing softly behind her. The space between them remained, neither close nor distant, allowing the moment to settle without pressure. "Sit," he said, gesturing lightly toward the table. She did, her posture composed, her hands resting quietly before her. As she met his gaze without lowering it, he remained standing for a moment longer, observing, as though confirming something unspoken before taking his place across from her. "You have had time to consider your position," he began, his tone even. "Now you will have the opportunity to define it." Eliza felt the weight of his words, not heavy, but precise. "I do not understand what position you believe I have," she replied honestly. Sebastian's expression did not change, but something in his gaze sharpened slightly, not in scrutiny, but in interest. "That depends on what you choose to accept," he said. "You may remain here as a guest, without obligation, until you determine your path, or you may choose something else." Eliza held his gaze, the unfamiliar space of possibility opening once more before her. And what is that something else? She asked. He did not answer immediately. And in that brief silence, the air seemed to still, as if the room itself waited for what would be said next. A place beside me, he said at last, his voice low, unwavering. Not as someone rescued, not as someone hidden, but as someone who stands by choice. The words settled between them, quiet, yet powerful in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. Eliza's breath stilled, not from fear, but from the realization that what he offered was not protection alone, it was recognition, and for the first time, she understood that the choice before her was not simply about where she would stay, it was about who she would become. The silence that followed his words did not feel empty, but full, as though something unseen had shifted into place between them. Eliza did not look away, though the weight of what he offered settled deeply, not pressing, but undeniable, a place beside him, not beneath, not hidden, not carried, but chosen. Her fingers remained still against the surface of the table, yet she felt the quiet tremor beneath her composure, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar shape of possibility that had been placed before her. You speak as if it is simple, she said at last, her voice steady but softer now. It is not, Sebastian replied without hesitation, but it is clear. His gaze did not waver, not demanding agreement, not urging her forward, only presenting the truth as he saw it. Leaving the decision entirely in her hands, Eliza lowered her eyes for a moment, not in submission, but in thought. The room around her remained still, the light steady, the world beyond the windows continuing without interruption, and yet everything within her felt as though it stood at the edge of something irreversible. She thought of the door that had closed behind her, of the voices that had dismissed her as if she held no value beyond what they could assign. She thought of the street, the rain, the way the world had turned away, without hesitation, and then she thought of this moment, of the man across from her who had not asked her to prove anything before offering her a place to stand. Her gaze lifted again, clearer now, more certain. And if I accept, she asked, what does that truly mean? Sebastian leaned back slightly, not distancing himself, but allowing space for the question to exist fully. It means you will not be treated as someone waiting to be sent away, he said. It means your presence here will not be temporary unless you choose it to be. It means when you are seen, you will be seen as someone who belongs by decision, not by circumstance. The words did not sound grand, yet they carried a quiet power that settled deeper than any promise of comfort could have. Eliza felt something shift within her again, something aligning not with hope, but with recognition. She had been given shelter before in her life, offered in ways that came with conditions unspoken, yet always present. But this was different. This was not shelter alone. This was position. She rose slowly from her seat, the movement unhurried, deliberate, as if each second allowed her to understand more clearly what she was choosing. Sebastian did not stand, did not interrupt, only watched with that same steady attention as she stepped away from the table, then paused a few feet from him. The distance between them felt intentional, not a barrier, but a space that belonged equally to both of them. You said I would have a choice, she said quietly. And I do, he answered. Eliza held his gaze, her posture straight, her voice calm, though something deeper moved beneath it. Then I will not stand here as someone waiting to be allowed to stay, she said. If I remain, it will not be as a guest. The words settled, clear, final, carrying more weight than anything she had spoken since entering this place. Sebastian's expression did not change, yet something in his eyes sharpened, not in surprise, but in confirmation. Then you understand, he said simply. Eliza did not nod, did not soften, only stood as she was, steady, present, no longer uncertain of where she stood within this moment. The space between them remained, yet it no longer felt undefined. It felt chosen, and somewhere beyond the walls of the estate, the world that had cast her aside continued as it always had, unaware that the girl they had dismissed had just stepped into a place where she would no longer be overlooked. Nothing in the room moved, yet everything had changed. The air itself seemed to settle differently, as if the space between them had shifted from uncertainty into something defined, something chosen. Eliza did not step back, did not soften her stance, and for the first time since she had crossed the threshold of this estate, there was no trace of hesitation in her posture. She stood as someone who had decided, not someone waiting to be decided for. Sebastian rose then, the motion unhurried, deliberate, his height adding nothing to his presence because it had never required it. He faced her fully now, the distance between them closing by a single step, not enough to invade, but enough to acknowledge what had just been spoken. Then you will not be treated as anything less, he said, his voice calm, unwavering. Not a promise offered lightly, but a statement of fact. Eliza held his gaze, searching not for reassurance, but for truth, and finding it in the steadiness that had not faltered since the moment he had stepped out into the rain. What does that look like? She asked, not out of doubt, but from the need to understand the reality behind his words. Sebastian considered her briefly, not because he lacked an answer, but because he chose to give one that would not be mistaken. It looks like you standing where others will see you, he said, not hidden within these walls, not protected from view, but present in a way that cannot be dismissed. The implication settled quietly, yet its weight was unmistakable. Eliza felt it, the shift from survival to visibility, from being unseen to being acknowledged, not just here, but beyond this place, and they will question it, she said, her voice steady. They will question you, he corrected, his tone unchanged. They do not question me. There was no arrogance in the statement, only certainty, the kind that did not need to defend itself. Eliza allowed a small breath to escape, not quite a laugh, but something close to it, a brief recognition of the world. She had stepped into a world where his name alone reshaped the rules others lived by. Then I will be the one they look at, she said. Yes, he answered simply, and you will decide how they remember what they see. The words did not intimidate her as they might have the night before. Instead, they settled into something steadier, something that aligned with the quiet strength she had held on to even when it had brought her nothing in return. Very well, she said at last. The agreement was not spoken loudly, not marked by ceremony, yet it carried more finality than anything else she had said that morning. Sebastian inclined his head slightly, acknowledging not her acceptance of his offer, but her acceptance of her own place within it. Then we begin today, he said. He turned then, moving toward the tall windows that overlooked the grounds, his posture unchanged, his presence as steady as the structure of the estate itself. There are those who will arrive this evening, he continued, people who expect to see what they have always seen. Eliza stepped forward slightly, drawn not by him, but by the direction of what lay ahead. And they will not, she said. Sebastian glanced back at her, the faintest shift in his expression suggesting something that might have been approval. No, he said quietly, they will not. The light from the windows stretched across the floor between them, illuminating the space that had once been uncertain and was now defined by choice. And as Eliza Whitmore stood within it, no longer cast out, no longer waiting, the world beyond those walls moved unknowingly toward a moment where it would be forced to see her not as she had been, but as she had chosen to become. The remainder of the day passed with a quiet precision that felt almost unfamiliar to Eliza, as though the hours themselves had been arranged with intention rather than left to unfold without direction. She was not hurried, not instructed with urgency, yet everything around her seemed to move in preparation for something unseen. Servants passed through the corridors with measured steps, their voices low, their movements efficient, each action carried out without excess. Without hesitation, it was a rhythm she began to understand, not one of chaos or command, but of quiet order, where nothing needed to be said. Twice by late afternoon, the light had softened, casting long shadows across the floors as the estate shifted into a different kind of stillness, one that carried anticipation rather than rest. Eliza stood before the tall mirror in her room, her reflection steady, composed. Though her thoughts moved with quiet intensity, she had been given garments more suitable for the evening, not extravagant, not overwhelming, but refined in a way that required no explanation. The fabric fell smoothly, the color deep and understated, chosen not to draw attention through excess, but to hold it through presence. She adjusted nothing, changed nothing, because there was nothing to correct. The door opened with a soft knock, and the same woman entered, her gaze briefly assessing before giving a single nod. They have begun to arrive, she said. Eliza met her reflection once more, not searching for reassurance, but confirming what she already knew. Then I will not keep them waiting, she replied. The walk to the main hall felt different from before, not longer, not shorter, but heavier with meaning. Each step carried her further into A space where she would no longer be unseen. The distant murmur of voices reached her before the doors came into view, refined, controlled, yet unmistakably filled with expectation. The doors opened, not abruptly, but with the same measured precision that defined everything within this place. The room beyond was filled with light. Chandeliers casting a warm glow over polished surfaces and carefully arranged figures. Conversations moved in quiet currents, rising and falling in practiced tones until, one by one, they began to still. It was not immediate, not forced, but inevitable. The shift moved through the room like a ripple, subtle at first, then undeniable. Heads turned, voices lowered, and for a moment that stretched longer than time itself. Every gaze settled upon her. Eliza did not falter. She stepped forward, her posture straight, her movements unhurried, as if she had always belonged in this space. Though every person in the room knew she had not, Sebastian stood at the far end, his presence unchanged, his attention already on her before the others had even realized she was there. He did not move toward her immediately. He did not need to. The space between them closed not by distance, but by recognition. She reached his side without hesitation, without pause, and when she stopped, she did not look to him for permission. She simply stood. Then, and only then, did he move a single step, precise, deliberate, placing himself not before her, not behind her, but beside her. You have all arrived expecting familiarity, Sebastian said, his voice calm, carrying easily through the room without effort. You will not find it here tonight. The words settled over the gathered guests, their expressions shifting in quiet confusion, curiosity, calculation. Eliza remained still, aware of every gaze, every unspoken question, yet untouched by them in the way she might once have been. Sebastian's gaze moved across the room, not seeking approval, not anticipating resistance, only acknowledging what stood before him. This is Eliza Whitmore, he continued, and she stands here by my decision. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the weight of something that could not be undone, and in that silence, Eliza felt it, the shift, the moment where she was no longer defined by the door that had closed behind her, but by the place she had chosen to stand within. Now the silence did not break immediately. As though the room itself resisted being the first to respond, the gathered guests stood suspended within the weight of what had just been declared, their expressions carefully composed, yet no longer untouched. A woman near the center of the room shifted slightly, her fan pausing mid-motion as her gaze moved from Eliza to Sebastian and back again, searching for some sign that this was temporary, that it could be explained away. Your Grace, she began, her tone controlled, polite, yet edged with something sharper beneath. We were not aware that you had made such a decision. Sebastian did not turn toward her immediately, his attention remaining forward, as if the question itself required no urgency. You are aware now, he replied simply. A faint murmur passed through the room, not loud enough to disrupt the composure expected of them, but enough to reveal that the balance had shifted. Eliza felt every glance, every quiet judgment forming behind careful expressions, yet none of it reached her in the way it once might have. She did not shrink beneath it. She did not defend herself. She simply stood. Another voice followed, this one more measured, belonging to a man whose posture suggested both confidence and caution. Miss Whitmore, he said, acknowledging her directly. Forgive the curiosity, but your presence here is unexpected. Eliza turned her gaze toward him, her expression calm, her voice steady. Then it is fortunate that expectation was not required, she replied. The words did not rise in challenge, yet they did not yield either. A subtle shift moved through the room again. Less uncertainty now, more awareness that she would not be easily dismissed. Sebastian's gaze moved then, not to silence the room, but to observe it, as though he allowed the moment to unfold only as far as it chose to go before bringing it to its natural end. You are here as guests, he said, his tone even, unaltered, not as arbiters of what stands within these walls. The statement settled with quiet finality, leaving no space for further questioning. Without consequence, the woman lowered her gaze slightly. The man inclined his head, and the murmurs faded, not out of agreement, but out of understanding. Eliza remained still beside him, aware not only of the room, but of the subtle shift within herself. The weight of their attention no longer pressed Against her as it had on the street, it did not define her, it revealed her, and in that revelation, something steadier took hold. The evening resumed, though not as it had begun. Conversations restarted in softer tones, glances still cast in her direction, but now tempered with something else, something that bordered on caution, perhaps even respect. Eliza moved through the space when required, not guided, not hidden, but present. Her steps measured, her posture unchanged. She did not attempt to belong, she simply did. Sebastian remained near, not hovering, not directing, but always within reach of her awareness, his presence a constant that did not need to assert itself. When their paths aligned once more near the far side of the room, he spoke without turning fully toward her. "They will speak of this long after they leave," he said. Eliza did not look away from the room before her. "They spoke before I arrived," she replied quietly. "They will continue either way." A faint pause followed. Then the slightest shift in his expression, something that might have been acknowledgement. "And does that concern you?" he asked. Eliza allowed herself a single breath, her gaze steady, her voice calm. "No," she said, "because this time, they will speak of me while I am still standing." The words settled between them, not as defiance, but as truth, and for the first time, the room that had once seemed filled with silent judgment now felt smaller, less imposing, as though its power had never truly belonged to those who filled it, but to the one who refused to be diminished within it. The evening did not end with applause or declaration, but with something quieter, something far more lasting. As the final guests began to depart, their voices lowered, their movements measured, Eliza remained where she stood, no longer at the edge of the room, no longer uncertain of her place. The doors opened and closed in steady rhythm, each departure carrying with it the echo of what had been witnessed, something that would not easily fade into polite conversation or quiet dismissal. Sebastian stood nearby, his presence unchanged, observing without interference as the room slowly returned to its original stillness. When at last the final carriage had left and the silence settled fully once more, the space felt different, not empty, but resolved. Eliza exhaled softly, not from relief, but from the quiet recognition that something irreversible had taken place. She turned slightly, her gaze meeting his without hesitation. "It is done," she said. He regarded her for a moment, as if weighing not her words, but the truth behind them. "It has begun," he corrected gently. The distinction did not unsettle her. Instead, it settled into something deeper, something she understood without needing further explanation. She stepped away from the center of the room, her movements no longer shaped by the awareness of being watched, but by the quiet certainty of being present for herself. The chandeliers dimmed slightly as the evening gave way to night, the golden light softening into something more subdued, more private. The grand hall, once filled with observation and judgment, now belonged only to the two of them, and the quiet that followed. Eliza moved toward the tall windows, her reflection faint against the dark glass beyond, the estate grounds stretching out into the night untouched, unbothered by what had unfolded within its walls. "They will speak of this," she said quietly, not as a question. Sebastian joined her, his reflection appearing beside hers, equal in the glass, neither overshadowing the other. "They already are," he replied. Eliza watched her reflection for a moment longer, studying not her appearance, but the presence within it, the steadiness, the absence of hesitation, the quiet strength that had always existed but had never been allowed to stand without resistance. "Then let them," she said at last, her voice calm, "because for the first time, they will not be speaking about someone who cannot answer." Sebastian's gaze remained on her reflection, not interrupting, not correcting, only witnessing the shift that had taken place. "No," he said softly, "they will not." The silence that followed was not empty, it was full of something newly formed, something that did not need to be named to be understood. Eliza turned from the window then, her posture unchanged, her steps steady as she moved toward the doorway, no longer pausing at thresholds, no longer waiting for permission. She stopped only once, just before crossing fully into the corridor beyond, her hand resting lightly against the doorframe for the briefest moment, as if acknowledging what had been left behind and what had been claimed in its place. "I was not chosen tonight," she said quietly, not turning back. "I chose where I would stand." The words lingered in the air, not as defiance, but as truth. Sebastian did not move to follow immediately. He remained where he was, watching as she stepped forward, not away from him, but into something that now belonged to her as much as it did to him. And as the door closed softly behind her, the estate did not return to what it had been before, because some changes, once made, do not fade, they settle, they remain. And they reshape everything that follows, and somewhere beyond the quiet walls, in a world that had once turned her away without a second thought, her name had already begun to carry a different weight, not as someone who had been cast out, but as someone who had stepped forward and was never leaving again.